Okay, so good evening, everybody.
Mhm.
And I was going back and forth in my own mind about how to start this class tonight, but I think I will start this class by looking at the meme that I mentioned in my rabbi's message yesterday, and on the off chance that some of you don't necessarily read it all or don't read it through or whatever, I'll bring that up on the screen again. All right, so this is a meme that comes up frequently after pretty much any prominent um, incident of anti-Semitism. I've seen it several times over the last 2-3 years. I've seen it a lot in the last week or 10 days or so since Kanye West started, with his tweet that he was going DEFCON 3 on the Jews, and then doubled down and tripled down and quadrupled down on that. It was sent to me by a cousin. I didn't respond, but I want to look at it not because I agree with it, quite the opposite. I do not agree with it, and I think it's actually very harmful. But and this is kind of a play on that famous poem by Reverend Martin Niemöller, right? First, they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak up because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the communists, and I did not speak up because I was not a communist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak up because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak up. All right, so this says, first they came for LGBTQ, and I stood up because love is love. Then they came for immigrants, and I stood up because families belong together. Then they came for the Black community, and I stood up because Black lives matter. Then they came for me, but I stood alone because I am a Jew. Okay, now, I've seen this shared actually by a lot of people who I like and respect, okay? But I think this meme is first of all, it's factually wrong. And then I personally think that there's another agenda here, okay, which is an agenda to get Jews to stop standing up for immigrants and LGBT people and Black people and so on and so forth, on the theory that they don't care about us, so why should we care about them? Right? But I think it is factually untrue. I mean, the example that I gave yesterday is the example of the Adidas Corporation, right? Now, I am not under any illusion. I mean, there are not, most corporations exist to make money well, in theory, all corporations, right, exist to make money for their shareholders, right? For some, their social mission is a part of their corporate identity, but even so, I mean, Ben and Jerry's, for example, their social mission helps their marketing. There's no question about it, right? And I am under no illusions that Adidas, whoever runs Adidas woke up a few days ago and said, "Oh, this is so terrible. This is so horrible. How can we make money by being in bed with this horrible anti-Semitic person?" I don't for a minute believe that that's what happened, right? But I do believe that they weighed the cost of, how much money they would lose by backing out of their contract with Kanye West versus how much money they would lose by being boycotted. Okay. And believe me, if it was just Jews boycotting them, Kanye West would probably win the day, right? As I pointed out, right, there are 16 million Jews in the entire world, um, many of whom don't wear sneakers. I mean, I have to say that my favorite pair of sneakers, which I bought years ago, happened to be Adidas. And I'm glad that I don't have to at least go around saying, "Oh, look, I bought them years ago. Don't get mad at me for wearing Adidas, right? But but the fact that they made a rational business decision, what does that tell you, right? It tells you that it's not just Jews who care about this issue. Only Jews who cared about this issue, it would not be an economically rational decision on their part to stop doing business with Kanye. Okay, so it has to be more than just Jews, right? And the fact of the matter is that it's not just Jews. I mean, tonight happens to be the 4th anniversary of the Tree of Life massacre, right? And if you remember what happened when we had that interfaith service, right? We had an interfaith service. An interfaith service, by definition, is not just Jews, right? I mean, the first person who contacted me, literally the first person who contacted me, was the imam of the mosque in Germantown, right? And he spoke, and the LDS, the Mormon bishop of the area, spoke, and a couple of Protestant clergy spoke. And we have allies. And when you have a meme that basically says we don't have any allies, right? If I was, like for example, there's a professor at Duke University. He's an imam. He was the Muslim campus chaplain, and now he's a professor of interfaith studies at the Duke Divinity School, Imam Abdullah Antepli. Okay, and he brings groups of Muslim leaders to Israel all the time because he feels that you cannot understand contemporary Judaism and American Jews without understanding our attachment to Israel. And he gets vilified by people within the Muslim community, right? Vilified. And if I was Imam Antepli and I saw this meme shared by people with whom I've worked, how would I feel, right? It's a slap in the face. It says, the risks that you take to support us, we don't acknowledge and they don't matter. Okay, now if you want to come back and say to me, there should be more such people, I agree with you. But saying there should be more such people is not the same thing as saying there are no such people, right? So it may, I don't know. I think a lot of Jews really get nachas, a sort of perverse kind of nachas, by feeling that, the whole world hates us. And a lot of people hate us, but it's not the whole world. And if we pretend that it is the whole world, I think, as I said, it's factually incorrect, but I think it's also counterproductive, right? So that's what sort of got my head spinning to do the talk tonight. And I will pause here because I like to pause, and hear what you have to say, but I really don't want to get bogged down in a discussion of, how many people, whatever. But if there are, questions or comments, of course, always welcome. Yes, Sue.
Well, I've been reading some things in the paper, and I agree with what you're saying, but I wonder if also kind of what played into for Kanye or Ye or whatever, I wonder if it was, he was made many anti-Black comments and wearing the T-shirt he did. So, it was like two different groups that
Sure.
he was attacking. So I think, that may play into it as well, because there were many Black people, of course, that were against what he did as well.
Right. Right, and there's no question, and I also hear from some blacks that, oh, when Kanye was just attacking blacks, he got a pass, but when he started attacking Jews, and I mean, that's kind of the Jewish, I mean, rather, that's kind of the black equivalent of this meme, right? Nobody cares about, and I mean, it is I mean, that type of is also an anti way because it feeds into the Jews control the world, right? And it's okay, you can get away with attacking black people, but you can't get away with attacking Jewish people, right? And I'm not sure if the corollary to that is that you should get away with attacking Jewish people, or people should step up more quickly when black people are attacked. If it's the first, yes. If it's the second, no. Mike.
Rabbi, I just can't understand. I don't know if this is going to come up in your planned comments. I cannot understand what would take a guy who's making millions a year and toss it, destroy his own career. I mean, unless it's abject stupidity or insanity, what would cause somebody to be so self-destructive with no, I don't understand what was in it for him, mentally, physically, emotionally, religiously, whatever. It absolutely blows my mind.
Okay, I don't, again, I don't, this is not a class on Kanye, but since you asked, right? I mean, no, Kanye has bipolar disorder. Okay, and I mean, as many of you know, I have some experience of people who have bipolar disorder, and one of the symptoms of bipolar mania is grandiosity, right? That I can do anything and nobody can stop me. And also, I'm such a genius that nobody understands my genius. Okay. So, and in fact, a few days before, I mean, lest you think that Kanye doesn't think what he said is anti-Semitic, he gave an interview where he said, you see, I can say things that are blatantly anti-Semitic and not lose my deal with Adidas. Okay. And then he lost his deal with Adidas. Okay. And yesterday, if you saw, he showed up unannounced and uninvited at the headquarters of Skechers and tried to convince them to pick up the deal that Adidas had left. And they literally tossed him out. Right now, you have to, and then I'll move on to the Nostra Aetate stuff. And I don't go in for hyperbole, right? I mean, how people toss the term Nazi around. Adidas was literally founded by a Nazi, right? I mean, the founder of Adidas was a member of the Nazi Party. And to think that a company that was literally founded by a Nazi is going to drop you, and then a company run by Jews is going to pick you up, right? There is some disconnect there, right? There is definitely some disconnect there. Okay, but Dee, go ahead.
This is just a quick question from a literary basis. The meme that you attributed to, did you say Mueller?
Niemöller. It's a play on what what Niemöller. Now, of course, many things take on a life of their own, right? First of all, if Niemöller said it, he said it in German, not in English. First of all. Second of all, the question of whether that is actually accurately attributed to him and so on and so forth is disputed by historians, way above my pay grade, as I don't know German and I'm not an expert in World War II or the history of the German resistance. But it's attributed to Pastor Martin Niemöller, who was an anti-Nazi Protestant minister in Germany who spent much of the war in a concentration camp.
Okay, my question was more simple than that, and I'm not challenging that. For some reason, I guess it's just things that I read and taught. I always thought that that belonged to Elie Wiesel, but what I would
No.
guess is that he used it in his work Night.
Yeah, he would never have said that because it says, and then they came for the Jews.
Right.
And Wiesel was Jewish, and Wiesel didn't live in Germany.
No, I wasn't talking
Wiesel,
about, I wasn't talking about the last line. The last line for me has always been, and then they came for me.
right, but
So-
it makes no sense being attributed to Wiesel.
Okay,
Because Wiesel didn't live in Germany, he was Jewish, and he was from Sighet, which was Romania and is now Hungary, or vice versa. I'm not
Okay.
sure exactly.
okay.
Okay, Barry.
Do you happen to know the source of this meme, or
It just says living Jewishly, but I don't know what that is. Okay, I don't. Okay, so on to Nostra Aetate. So Nostra Aetate was the declaration of the Second Vatican Council, actually on non-Christian religions, okay, not just on Jews and Judaism, but generally, at least in the Christian Jewish field or whatever, when people say Nostra Aetate, they mean Catholic Church teaching on Jews and Judaism. Okay, and it was promulgated during the Second Vatican Council in 1965. By 1965, Paul VI was the Pope, but the Second Vatican Council was begun under Pope John the 23rd. Okay, and there is some relevant history here. John the 23rd, during the Second World War, had served as the papal ambassador in Turkey. And, you know, in many countries in Europe, and not only in Europe, Jews who could get out from Germany or from German occupied countries would go to embassies and try to either take shelter in the embassy or get visa to go to the West. I mean, there are other, like the Sugihara, who was the Japanese ambassador in Lithuania, who saved a lot of Jews. And actually, but anyway, so John the 23rd, whose birth name was Eugenio Pacelli, he was the Vatican ambassador in Turkey, and he did what he could to save Jews who took refuge in the Vatican embassy. Now, Turkey was never occupied by the Germans, but Greece was, Bulgaria was, a lot of the Balkan countries were. So, you know, there were, I mean, we tend to think of the Holocaust as mostly an Ashkenazi phenomenon, but it was a Sephardic phenomenon as well. The Jews in those countries are like Sephardic, Ladino speaking, you know, direct descendants of people who fled Spain in 1492. At any rate, so one Saturday morning in Rome when he was the Pope, and I'm not sure where he was going to or coming from, but he was being driven in his papal limousine, and they passed the Great Synagogue of Rome, and services were just letting out. And he told the driver, stop the car, and he got out of the car and he greeted and blessed the crowd. Right now, this may not seem like a big deal to us today, but in the late 50s, it was a really, really big deal. Okay. And similarly, in the late 50s, John the 23rd met with a French Jewish historian. And I've known about him for a long time, and I always read his name as Jules Isaac, but it's actually pronounced more like Jules Isaac. I mean, I don't speak French, but anyway. And he presented to the then Pope his research on what he called the teaching of contempt. Okay, how Christianity had taught contempt for Jews and Judaism, and how this had led in some ways to the Holocaust. Okay, and here, I mean, as a historian, you have to be really, really careful. Okay, because and I've heard people say incredibly stupid things about this, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that yes, Hitler, Yimach Shemo, was a baptized Catholic. Okay, and I have heard people say, oh, if the Pope had ordered Hitler not to murder the Jews, he wouldn't. Okay, I mean, that's absurd, right? I mean, the Pope orders American Catholics not to use birth control, right? And about 5% of American Catholics actually obey. Okay, so, but anti-Semitism, the seed of anti-Semitism had fertile ground in which to grow in Europe because of the teaching of contempt for Jews and Judaism, right? It was fertile ground that for close to 2,000 years, Christians had other Jews, had taught contempt for them, and this made the phenomenon of Nazism much more possible. And the Pope was very shaken by his meeting with Isaac, and he said to him, "You have the right to expect quite a bit from us." Okay, and then one of the things that Pope did was Good Friday, right, which is the day that Christians mark the crucifixion of Jesus, right? Good Friday has historically been, pun very much intended, a bad day for Jews, right? I mean, to the extent that, and I have no way of verifying if this is true, but the family legend in my family is that my grandfather, my father's father, was one of 6 children. That we know for sure. Only 5 of them came to the States. The 6th supposedly died as a young boy because the only doctor in their shtetl was a Christian, and my, I guess, great uncle got sick during Holy Week, during the week of Good Friday. And as an act of piety, the doctor did not treat Jews on Good Friday. And so my grandfather's brother died because of that. And while I don't have any way to verify that this is true, if you know the history, it's certainly plausible, right? It's certainly plausible. And there were often literal pogroms, massacres of Jews throughout Europe on Good Friday. And so there's a liturgy in the Good Friday service where they pray for certain groups of people, and for hundreds of years, the liturgy in Latin was pro perfides Judeos, for the perfidious Jews. And one Good Friday, the Pope is leading Mass, and he gets to that line, and he took a pencil and he crossed it out, okay, which you can do, I guess, if you're the Pope. And he crossed it out and he said, we're not saying this anymore. But during the Second Vatican Council, right, the question always was, what is the church going to say about Jews and Judaism? Okay, and here there was a lot of negotiation and discussion. The Vatican Council went on for a couple of years. There was concern within, because, I mean, the word Catholic, what does it mean, right? The word Catholic means universal, right? And we tend to think of Catholic and Roman Catholic as kind of interchangeable, right? But in point of fact, there are, I think, 17 different churches that are part of the Catholic Church, which is to say that they are under the authority of the Pope. And the Roman Catholic Church is only one of them. Okay, there are other non-Roman Catholic churches, meaning they are under the authority of the Pope, like the Greek Catholics, the Maronite Catholics, the Coptic Catholics, okay, the Assyrian Catholics, the Chaldean Catholics. I mentioned those 5 Catholic churches. Why mention those 5 specifically? What do they have in common? Yeah, Gail.
Well, there's also the Ukrainian Catholic. They're sitting there again versus the Orthodox churches like the
Right.
Greek Orthodox and the.
Right, but with the exception, yeah, Sue.
Well, I believe they're all in the Middle East.
Bingo, right? They're all in the Middle East. The Maronites are primarily in Lebanon, right? The Chaldean and Assyrian Catholics are in Iraq, right? The Coptic, now most Coptic, so about 10% of Egyptians are Coptic Christians, most of whom are Orthodox, but some of whom are Coptic Catholic. And the difference is simply whether they recognize the authority of the Pope or not, right? So there are, significant numbers of Arab Catholics who, however they may personally feel about Jews. I mean, the Maronites have for a long time been allied with Israel, right? But they were afraid that if the church went too far in reconciling with the Jews, that it would be harmful to Arab Catholics in the Middle East, right? So there are political considerations, right? And so there was a lot of negotiation, both internally within the Catholic Church, but also between the church and Jewish leaders. Okay, and one of the people very, very much involved in this was Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Okay, Heschel's known for a lot of things. He marched with King in Selma, but he was also very much involved in this. And he himself, as a Holocaust survivor, he was born in Poland, educated in Germany, deported from Germany, went back to Poland, came to London, and then to the United States. Lost most of his family in the Holocaust. And Heschel actually was hired as a consultant by the American Jewish Committee. And the American Jewish Committee is still probably the most prominent on the international level organization involved in dialogue with the Catholic Church. And he had a number of meetings with Cardinal Augustine Bea, who was sort of the Vatican point man on this. Heschel was also very close. Now, for some of you, this may be a familiar name. For others, you may say, who the heck is that? Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was an American Trappist monk, poet, author, activist. Now, I have to say, to be an activist and a Trappist monk is not easy because especially, I mean, they're a little bit looser now, but before Vatican II, the Trappists were a strictly cloistered order, meaning that you did not leave the monastery essentially really except to go to the doctor. And so, but Merton wrote lots of books. At the time, all of his books had to pass through censorship of the Trappist order before they could be published. And he carried on a voluminous correspondence with people all over the world. But if you wanted to meet Merton, you had to go to the Abbey. Merton was allowed to leave the Abbey really twice, once for a conference on religion and psychology at Columbia University, and then his final trip, he in '68 was allowed to travel to India to meet the Dalai Lama, and he was killed on that trip. So Merton had a close friendship with Heschel, but in order to meet with Heschel, Heschel had to go to the Abbey of Gethsemane, which is near Bardstown, Kentucky. Now, of course, we have Kentucky connections. I gave a couple of lectures at that Abbey. Stayed in the same room in the guest house where Heschel had stayed, where Martin Luther King had stayed, where Dan Berrigan had stayed. So, it's quite a lot of ghosts in that room. So Merton was also very involved in this. He would meet with Heschel, and then Merton would correspond with Cardinal Bea, and there was a lot of back and forth on the final statement. But the final statement said a couple of things that were important. One is that it essentially absolved the Jews of the charge of deicide, right? That is to say, the idea that the Jews killed Jesus. They did say that the Jewish leaders of that time pressed for the death of Jesus, which I happen to believe is not necessarily true. But nevertheless, it was the Romans who were in charge. He was killed by the Romans, and regardless, his death should not be attributed to all Jews alive at that time, let alone to the Jews of today, right? Which, and that, this, of course, the reason why Good Friday was such a dangerous period for Jews, because it was the day that Jesus was killed. And if the Jews killed Jesus, then it was kind of, a natural corollary to get even with the Jews for what they had done. There's a lot of incoherence in that. If Jesus' whole role was to be killed to take on the sins of humanity, then if we did it, you should be grateful, I think. But whatever. There's not a lot of logic in that. So the first important point was the absolving of Jews of responsibility for the crucifixion. The second is the statement that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Okay, now what does that mean? Okay, the term is supersessionism, right? In other words, according to the sort of line of historiography, right? Did God choose the Jews? Absolutely. God chose the Jews, right? And then the Jews screwed up. How did we screw up? We screwed up by rejecting Jesus, right? So God essentially took the gifts and the calling away from the Jews and gave it to the church, right? And thus the church is the new Israel, right? And you see that in a lot of, to this day. I mean, why are Catholic clergy called priests, right? Because they are the descendants of the priests, not biologically, but spiritually, they are the successors of the Kohanim, right? Why is the place where the priest officiates called an altar? Because it is spiritually the continuation of the altar in the temple, right? And so, and you know, I mean, so many Christian, I mean Catholic, but also Anglican, right? Like I think it was Blake, to build the new Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land, right? That's not an accident. I mean, they see themselves as having inherited the spiritual patrimony of the Jews, right? But historically, in other words, we got it, you guys are pushed out, right? So in Vatican II, in Nostra Aetate, they said, no, the gifts and promises of God are irrevocable, right? It doesn't mean that that Christianity is invalid, but Christianity is now seen as sort of a co-heir with Judaism instead of a replacement for Judaism, okay? And spiritually, I think this is actually kind of more important because it creates room for the affirmation of the continuing validity of Judaism and that kind of rapprochement. Okay, I will stop here for a second again in case there are any questions or comments. I think this is something that's not that well understood. All right, so we'll go on. You know, to give an example of how things have evolved since then, right? So, you know, I mentioned how John the 23rd had gotten rid of the prayer for the perfidious Jews, right? Now, I mean, the flip, it doesn't just say perfidious Jews. It said for the perfidious Jews that the veil may fall from their eyes and they may recognize Israel's true Messiah. Okay, today, the Roman Catholic Good Friday prayer, there's a prayer for the Jews, but it says that they may continue to be faithful to the calling of God as they hear it, right? So essentially, Catholics pray on Good Friday for Jews to be good Jews. I mean, it's quite remarkable. I mean, you know, could we pray for Catholics to be good Catholics? I don't know whether many Jews could bring themselves to utter a prayer on, let's say, Yom Kippur, right? That Catholics should be good Catholics, right? But they pray that Jews should be good Jews, that they should be faithful to the calling of God as they hear it. Okay, so after Paul VI, so John Paul II, and John Paul II, I think, did a tremendous amount to advance Catholic Jewish relations, right? And I think it's no accident. He lived through the Shoah in Poland. His best friend from childhood was Jewish. When he became Pope, he gave his best friend, his Jewish best friend, an apartment in the Vatican so that they could be close by. He had been part of the Polish underground, had helped after the war to rescue Jews who were, in the camps and trying to get back home. And he understood what was at stake. He also, and he himself spoke about this, that he always loved music. And in the town in Poland where he grew up, the main shul apparently had this amazing chazan, and he would sometimes go to shul with his Jewish friends to hear the chazan because the chazan was that good. Right. So, he understood what was at stake. And unlike, all of the Italian popes who had preceded him, he had Jewish friends. And this was really important. So, John the 23rd had greeted Jews outside the main synagogue in Rome. But John Paul II went to the synagogue and gave an address there. And then in visits to other countries, including the United States, he also visited synagogues. He was the first pope to visit Israel on a state visit. Pope Paul had actually been in Israel for a few hours in like 64. But it was a state visit to Jordan. Remember, in 64, Jerusalem was still divided, and the old city was in Jordanian hands. He went through the Mandelbaum Gate, which was the crossing point between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, and he visited West Jerusalem for a few hours, but it was not like considered an official visit. But John Paul II made an official visit, visited the Western Wall, visited the chief rabbis, and again, there was a lot of back and forth because there's a certain diplomatic symbolism, right? And John Paul went to visit the chief rabbis at their office rather than insisting that they come to the Vatican embassy to visit him. Okay, which was a big deal and scandalized. It scandalized people within the Vatican, right? Because the Pope is not supposed to acknowledge other religious leaders being at the same level as him. The first time that the Vatican bureaucracy turned against John Paul II was when he had an interreligious gathering in Assisi, and all of the religious leaders stood together on the same stage instead of the Pope being on the stage and everybody else below him. So he did really a lot. He was followed by Pope Benedict, who, in the opinion of many people, sort of turned the clock back a little bit. And I kind of agree with that, but fortunately, Benedict wasn't Pope for that long. But Benedict was a theologian, and he was kind of like the Vatican watchdog. That he was the heresy cop before he became the Pope. And Benedict's concern was essentially that, if we say, right, because here's the thing, right? According to official Catholic teaching, Jesus is the Redeemer of all. And you can't achieve salvation except through Jesus, right? But now we're going to say that you can achieve salvation not through Jesus if you're a Jew through Judaism, right? Well, Benedict didn't really have any problem with, much of a problem with that per se. But if we say that you can be Jewish and still achieve salvation, well, I mean, what about Protestants, right? Or Muslims, right? Or God forbid, Orthodox Christians, right? Let alone Hindus and Buddhists. We really are better off closing that door, right? Because then we're just going to become one religion among many rather than the true universal religion, right? But even under Benedict, I mean, statements were put out from the Vatican and from the American hierarchy, for example, that there should be no Catholic mission to the Jews, right? Why? In fact, they said Catholic mission to the Jews is impossible. Why? Because mission implies that you are not in a relationship with the true God, and we want to introduce you to a relationship with the true God. But Jews are already in relationship with the true God, so it's impossible to. Now, it doesn't mean that if some Jew decides somehow that they want to be Catholic, that a pope is going to kick him out, right? But I have had cases where people have come to me who were born as Jews and had gone to a priest to talk about being Catholic, and the priest said, go talk to a rabbi first, right? Explore your own religion first. And then if after exploring Judaism, you still want to become a Catholic, then come back and talk. But I won't even begin the process of converting you to Catholicism until you've explored Judaism. And I have to say, I have never once said that to a Catholic who came to me for conversion. Go talk to a priest first, right? Never in a million years would it occur to me that I ought to do that, right? So there's been now, and then, you know, Pope Francis was the Cardinal Archbishop of Argentina, of Buenos Aires, rather. He was the primate of all Argentina. And one of his closest friends is Rabbi Abraham Skorka, who is the rector emeritus of the Seminario Rabbinico in Buenos Aires, a conservative rabbi, head of the conservative seminary in Buenos Aires. They wrote a book together, and Skorka is now actually a professor at Georgetown, which, you know, is interesting because, look, I mean, as many of you know, I mean, my calling, if you want to call it that, to the rabbinate really began at Georgetown, right? And I would never have gone to Georgetown without the changes that Vatican II had wrought in the church. I mean, I would never, you know, have felt comfortable there without, you know, the ability to take classes in Jewish studies and participate in Jewish life and so on and so forth. So, you know, there's been a tremendous, and the point that I want to make is that, you know, as I said in what I wrote yesterday, Jews cannot fight anti-Semitism alone, because anti-Semitism is not really a Jewish problem. It's really a Gentile problem, right? I mean, anti-Semites, I mean, there may be some Jewish anti-Semites, but for the most part, anti-Semites are Gentiles. And it's really only Gentiles who can fight anti-Semitism, right? And we can certainly, you know, be involved in discussions and negotiations and so on and so forth, but we can't we can't change things on our own. We can only change things through friendship and scholarship and discussions and negotiations, and we need allies. We need allies, and in order to have allies, we have to be allies, right? And that is why, remarkably, Jewish-Muslim relationships in the United States are great. All right. Now, why? Because first of all, 90% of American Muslims are not Arabs, right? They're mostly they're Pakistanis, they're Bangladeshis, they're African American Muslims. It's harder with Arab Muslims, but Muslim organizations and Jewish organizations work well together because we are the two largest non-Christian religious groups in the country. And Muslims come to us and they say, we want to learn how you've done it, right? We want to learn from you how to function in this pluralistic society. And so, so to me, the lessons of Nostra Aetate are always to keep dialogue open and to look for allies. And I mentioned one other thing, that when Benedict was the Pope, there was a conference at Georgetown on Catholic teaching about Jews and Judaism. And it was a small conference, and there were about like 20 important Catholic leaders, and they invited like 5-6 rabbis to come as well, to sort of like be participant observers. Like they say, well, we think we ought to teach this. How does that sound to Jews? Right. And that's kind of like what went on with Vatican II. And I was fortunate to be one of the handful of rabbis invited to participate in this kind of dialogue. So, the kind of high level religious diplomacy is really important. So at this point, I'm gonna shut up and take questions, comments, rebuttals, objections. You guys, you know the way we do this. So Dee, go ahead.
I just want to go back to something that you spoke about earlier. For those people who have either never traveled to Greece or have never traveled to any of the Greek islands, if and when you go to Greece and have the chance, go to the island Rhodes. The Rhodes is often spoken about in literature in a classical sense, but I want to speak about it in a different way. This was a lesson that was so powerful for me. Rhodes actually had the exact same kind of situation that was presented by the story about Schindler's List. At Rhodes, how many of you know about this? Because I don't want to take okay. Rhodes had a very young mayor, or whatever the title was of that island. He was about 35 years old. And there was what you would consider to be a very significant Jewish ghetto in Rhodes. And early on, that ghetto wasn't something imposed like we think about with Hitler. It was simply another way of saying the part of the island where the Jews chose to live. It still stands. And one of the most famous stories about the Holocaust is that when they knew that the Nazis were coming, and nobody ever figured out how the Nazis even thought to look at Rhodes, there was a box at the outside of the ghetto where people who chose to stay to fight, just like in the Warsaw Ghetto, left notes in hopes that people to come would remember them. There's also what's left of original shul that was there. The point of my story is that when word got to Rhodes that the Nazis were coming, this young mayor, whatever, managed to get, I don't know how many, I don't know the numbers, but he managed to get forged passports and credentials and money for, I don't know how many people that he saved, but he served the same role that Schindler did and saved numerous lives. The other thing that's very fascinating to see when you go to, and everything I've described for you is there to see. In the center of town of this little island is what I would call a miniature Washington Monument. What's the geometric term? Obelisk?
Obelisk.
Yeah, right smack in the center of the town. It's about as tall as I am or as small as I am. And there's a plaque on the front of it, and it's dedicated to the Jewish community and to the people who were lost or saved. I forget which way it's shown, but it's absolutely fascinating. And when you talk to any citizen on that island, and if you introduce yourself, after I heard the story, I literally was stopping to talk to people and thanking them for their efforts and their ancestors' efforts. And they were just so receptive of, it was more of meeting another Jew than it was of meeting an American Jew. But it is really fascinating, and you never really hear very much about this. Thank you for
Yeah.
letting me share it.
I just want to add to, it's very interesting because I intend to go there to that particular synagogue. Its name is Kehilat Shalom.
Right, right. And it also has a whole section where mikveh existed. So there was some very, very religious observant Jews on roads as well. And by the way, the person that I'm talking about as the leader who saved all of these people was, what was I going to say? Was not Jewish himself, had no Jewish connections with his family, with anybody.
Okay, Sue.
I know that there was quite a bit in the Good Friday service of the Orthodox Church. I had occasion to look through some of their literature and their liturgy. And I wonder if you know whether there's been any effort recently to kind of, deal with that information in their liturgy.
I literally do not know. I mean, what I can tell you of what I do know of the Orthodox Church is that the Orthodox Church tends to be very resistant to any sort of theological change or development. So my guess is that they have not made the kind of revisions in teaching that the Catholics have made, and in the wake of the Catholic Church, lots of Protestant churches. But I don't know that for a fact. Yeah. Anyone else? All right, Lori, go ahead.
Okay, just two quick questions. On the meme that started our discussion, there's they, this, and they, and they, and they, and I'm curious as to who the they is in this case, if you know, or what your thoughts are. And then also whether you think that there will be any good that comes out of this whole event.
All right. I mean, I'm not sure who the they is really. I mean, I don't think that that's really I mean, if you look at the flip side, right, because, right, love is love, Black Lives Matter, families belong together. So they're talking about like, well, the families belong together. So that would be the family separation thing, right? And love is love would be anybody who opposes same-sex marriage. And Black Lives Matter. So I guess they're talking about the police. I'm not really sure. But in terms of, look, I mean, will good come out of it? That depends on people, right? And being an ally means that we don't demand 100% purity from our allies, right? And that is something that Jews sometimes forget, and people on the left often forget, frankly. All right, as somebody who, finds myself more generally on the left side of the spectrum, is that nobody is 100% pure, right? So if you look, for example, at Jewish-Catholic relations, right? I mean, Jews and Catholics, even in the policy sphere, right? And remember, I mean, religious groups are not allowed to endorse candidates. They are allowed to endorse legislation and policy, okay? The Jewish and the Catholic hierarchy agree on capital punishment, right? Again, it doesn't mean every Jew or every Catholic, right? But the official teaching of Judaism and Catholicism is against capital punishment, right? The Jewish and Catholic hierarchies agree on more generous immigration legislation, right? We agree on environmental stuff, right? Where do we disagree, right? Obviously, we disagree, you know, like 180 degrees on abortion, right? But, you know, we're willing, I mean, both communities are willing to say, okay, we disagree on abortion, but let's work together on the things that we do agree on. I mean, I think that that's an important lesson, right? I mean, that we all need allies, and we have to work together where we agree and agree to disagree where we disagree, rather than say, I can't work with you unless I agree with you on everything 100%. So that, you know, I think we have to at least, you know, hear the pain of the Black community when they say, you know, everybody's piling on Kanye when he went after the Jews, but when he went after Blacks, nobody cared. All right, I don't know if that's objectively true, but it's a feeling that people have. And we should say, you know, instead of saying, oh, I hear you, right? And that must be very painful, right? But the response is really all people's pain matters, not Jewish pain also shouldn't matter, right? So I think that good things can come out of this. I mean, there is at a very high level, the American Jewish Committee, right, which you know, of the major Jewish organizations, is probably the most conservative, right? I mean, you know, they originally represented moneyed German Jews, but the American Jewish Community and the Islamic Society of North America have a Muslim Jewish coalition. Right now, a lot of things that they stand for that we don't stand for, and vice versa. But you know, the climate in this country the last few years has been such that Jews and Muslims understand that we need to work together. There's a Black Jewish caucus in Congress that the American Jewish Committee also helped to start, right? Again, we'll agree on things and disagree on things, but we have to work together. And I think, you know, so I mean, I think good things can come out of this if we want it to. And that's on all of us, frankly. I mean, I know that sounds kind of Pollyannish, but that's what I really believe. Anyone else? All right. If not, then Laila Tov and Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining.
Shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Thank you.
Thank
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Yashikov.
Thank you.